Bryn, thank you very much for coming along for tonight's Youngly Mason Social. I'm not even quite sure what we're up to now, but we must be somewhere between 15, 16 maybe now. For anyone that's new, that's just come onto these socials, we started this back in April, and it's just naturally evolved since then. What we try and do is we give new and young Mason clubs and light blue clubs and white table clubs chance to just promote themselves, and we give them a chance to spotlight everything that they do, all the great initiatives that they have, and yeah, it's proved to be quite successful so far. Everyone's taken all the ideas and adapting it for their provinces, so it's working out very well. We also try and get some decent guests in, like we have tonight with Tim. We've had some brilliant guests along the way. Your most worshipful Grand Master, Christine Chapman, who's here tonight supporting the Pale Blue Club. She was one of our guests also. So what we're going to do is we're just going to kick it off, I think, with worshipful brother Leslie Adams, who's going to talk about the Pale Blue Club. Over to you, Leslie. You got it? There you
go. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Lovely to see you, and thank you for inviting me to talk about Freemasons for Women's Pale Blue Club. I was asked by our Grand Master, the Most Worshipful Christine Chapman, who's here this evening, to take over the running of our Pale Blue Club just under about a year ago, as it had been redundant for a little while. Having previously had social and informative events at our headquarters in 402 Finchley Road, London, my future plans to continue these were scuppered by, of course, this great COVID-19 pandemic which is upon us, that started in March of last year, and of course our first lockdown. So I swiftly decided to go with Zoom, which was the only way forward at the time, and it has turned out to be more amazing than I ever imagined. For the first time, we can connect visually with our brethren in all our lodges all over the UK, and indeed the rest of the world. Our lodges up north, the Isle of Man, our two lodges in Spain, Calahonda and Alicante, Gibraltar, Romania, India and the USA, something that had been so restricted due to distance and time zones. Our Pale Blue Club has no criteria, no fees, and the only eligibility is that a member must be a Pale Blue Freemason. No Grand Lodges allowed, I'm afraid. We hold our get-togethers once a month, usually on a Tuesday evening, about 6 p.m. This enables us to let our Indian Lodge members join us just before bedtime, and our US brethren at their midday break. Our first meeting was actually in June 2020. At each session, we try to find interesting subjects and speakers that are usually member-led topics. Our breakout rooms are the highlight, where the girls can meet each other and get to know brethren from other lodges, and are given the opportunity to connect with them on a personal and social level, hopefully forging great friendships that they wouldn't normally be able to do. Sometimes we give them the quizzes or topics to discuss while they're in their rooms, which is great fun, and they really, really love these breakout rooms. In fact, they keep asking for them each time they come on. The rest of our 1 hour sessions are filled with question time, birthdays, forthcoming events, and sometimes fun polls. We have also set up a WhatsApp group for our Pale Blue Club members, containing information and a way for those that wish to connect socially, as well as a Google Drive account with information on previous sessions that they may have missed, recordings from speakers, and a calendar of events. Quarterly, we have something that little initiative that we've just started. We have a Pale Blue Club Social where we invite all our Masons in waiting. These are now being extended to 6 times a year. These are for all our prospective candidates who have already been interviewed by their lodges that they have chosen or have been designated to by our Grand Secretary, Very Worshipful Brother Maxine Priestley, but due to the pandemic have not been able to be initiated, or also for those that have made inquiries through the internet or have been introduced by friends, or even Pale Blue Club members that come on to these socials and bring along a friend that may have said that they just wanted to know a little bit more about women's Freemasonry. We've had some wonderful speakers and topics, and at our last autumn social, we were privileged to have the company of Worshipful Brother Tony Harvey, who gave a fabulous visual talk on Freemasonry and Freemasons, both for men and women, which was followed by an extensive question and answer time. So we went well over our hour, but everybody loved it and stayed behind to speak to him. This question often pops up. What is the difference between men and women's Freemasonry? The answer is none. Our fraternity, the HFAF, the Honourable Fraternity of Ancient Freemasons, which is now renamed the Freemasons for Women, follows the same format as the men's, the same ritual and the same principles. Our previous meeting last week was a topic close to so many, charity. And our president of the Grand Lodge Charity, Right Worshipful Brother Beverly Emden, gave us a wonderful insight to the many incredible charities we have supported and continue to do so. Our next winter social on the 21st of February for Pale Blue Club members and Masons in waiting will also be based around community and how much the young and the old in our fraternity have benefited from their Freemasonry, both in very diverse ways. I feel it's very important for our Masons in waiting to acknowledge the diverse members that we do have from around the world of all ages, young and old, and from all walks of life. And the Zoom platform has enabled me to do this in so many different ways. To keep our Masons in waiting informed and engaged, we have just set up a separate mailing list for Masons in waiting called the Freemasons for Women candidates. Although we are very aware that those assigned to lodges are invited to their own socials, we thought it would be beneficial if they had the chance to meet a wider group of women who were inquiring about Freemasonry. Our Freemasonry for Women candidates has a WhatsApp group where members can chat informally, and we have started a feature called Ask a Mason, where each month the questions asked by members are voted on. The question with the highest number of votes is answered by a Freemason for Women Freemason. On a regular basis, we plan on issuing Masons in waiting with information as well as special study sessions, especially prepared by the Worshipful Master of a Research Lodge. This centralizes contact for this group and ensure that all receive the same information at the same time. Our Pale Blue Club has of course got a brilliant presence on social media. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, which my amazing administrator, Brother Tina Candy, who's here this evening with this presentation for you, monitors and updates. Both Tina and myself are always available to answer any questions or concerns that any of our members may have at any time. When this pandemic subsides and we are allowed to meet again, Tina and I will continue to hold face-to-face socials, but we will definitely continue with our brilliant Zoom get-togethers so we can keep in touch with our brethren further afield. My aim has always been to make our Pale Blue Club fun, informative, social, and inspirational. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much for that. That was brilliant. You guys seem like you do an awful lot of things And that breakdown session that you all do is that sounds brilliant.
Breakout rooms, they love the breakout rooms. They really do. It just gives them a chance. Instead of being lots of people on a screen, they get to chat, and we try and mix them up. And obviously Zoom mixes them up, but it's great. They love it because they get to chat and talk and meet different people, and hopefully each time they come on, they get to meet other Masons as well. So
am I right in thinking, Leslie, that in terms of your fraternal organisation, it is quite sparse in terms of distance, so you're not all kind of that close to one another?
Well, we have obviously a big contingency in London and the surrounding areas, which is where our headquarters are, spread out, you know, down as far as Sussex, going up county, and then we've got another, can't think of the word, section up north, the Isle of Man. But we are able at Grand Lodge and all Masons to visit most of the lodges that are sort of around the UK. And our lodges up north hold meetings several times during the year that we can go and visit as well.
Yeah, I mean, because what I was thinking was because you ladies do so much in terms of online presence and your lectures and everything else, and because your audience is India in other parts of the world, have you noticed any kind of positive impact in doing these that have kind of increased any kind of fraternal bonds within your organisation through lockdown?
With the Zoom?
Yeah.
Amazing, unbelievable in all aspects. I'm a preceptor of my lodge. Just being able to do LOIs on Zoom. Not everyone can make the LOIs. I mean, we have LOIs usually the week before our meetings, unlike the men. I think that you have them sort of every week. We have them before each meeting, and it's difficult. Girls, especially the younger girls now, have all got jobs. They're tied up at work. They can't get there in time. So it's given me a fantastic platform, and socials where everybody can come along. Some can't because they're tied up at work, family. And it's just brought everybody together. It really, really has. And as I said, with the Pale Blue Club, we've been able to outreach to all the other countries where we have lodges, which you wouldn't be able to do. And of course, even ones, you know, we've got lodges in Coventry, Sussex, Bournemouth, all over, which it's hard for them to come to London. It's a journey, and they come for meetings. So it's nice for them to be able to come to socials on Zoom. So yes, definitely.
Yeah, I think particularly through everything that's been going on, it's provided a real positive tool, I think, for everyone. This platform as well as others. It's been great.
Leslie, as a part of any club or organisation, the secretary usually finds it difficult to wrangle its own members from one province, let alone the whole world. How do you find bringing all your members together and keeping them connected, bearing in mind, like you say, they do live all over the place, and maybe time issues are difficult?
With Zoom or on a regular basis?
Just on a regular basis.
Well, we keep in touch. That obviously each lodge has its abroad has its installations, which as many of us that can try to attend. Our America Lodge unfortunately missed its installation that we could go to this year because of the pandemic, which was in March. But there's a contingency of Grand Lodge and members that go and visit wherever we can. I mean, Spain is very accessible. Lots of people, they make a holiday of it and go. And all the other lodges, everybody goes to. We visit whenever we can. People make friends in other lodges, support each other in other lodges. And so you make a concerted effort to go and visit them whenever you can.
Craig from the Adair Club, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question? And I fear it's a question that you may get asked quite a lot. Craig, are you there? I'll ask it for him. He says, why, Leslie, why do you call yourselves brothers and not sisters? Do you get,
I'm actually going to let our Grand Master Christine Chapman to answer that, because she answers it so well.
I believe she answered it last time as well.
Yes.
I answer it on a regular basis.
Yes.
We consider ourselves to be members of a universal brotherhood of Freemasonry. That's why we're brothers and not sisters.
Fantastic.
And we have been brothers since the early 1900s. So it would be very, very strange for us to think of ourselves as sisters.
Of course. I think this is probably why Craig didn't unmute himself. But thank you, Craig, all the same. Dan Cook from the Northampton Hunts Young Masons Club, what is your question?
Yeah, I just wondered whether within your socials you involve the family as well. So we try to get our wives and children involved with some of the light blue socials we do. I just wondered whether you did the same, and also whether your partner or husband hates it as much as my wife does.
I think he's been so used to it over all the years where he's come to socials. No, he enjoys it. I mean, he's not a Freemason, but no, he enjoys the socials. The Pale Blue Club haven't done that as of yet. I know a lot of our lodges have had socials involving partners, families, but that is possibly something we could do in the future. We try and keep we call them get-togethers because they're not meetings. Our get-togethers to sort of an hour. I think a lot of our lodges are having LOIs during the week, they're having socials during the week, and just don't want to flood them. I think at the beginning of the pandemic, the Zoom was a novelty and everybody was glad to get onto it. But I think a lot of people are working from home, they're on their screens all the time. So we try and keep it to sort of the minimum, the amount of time that people are on. But that is something I think we could consider, maybe a few times a year, have a social, especially with our brethren from abroad, might be fun. So yeah, thank you, Dan. That's something we could consider. Thank you.
Christine, how important has the Pale Blue Club been to the fraternity as a whole for you?
Well, we've had several goes at setting this up and none of them have been successful, and we asked Leslie to take it on, and as they say, she picked up the idea and ran with it. And it's been extremely successful, and I think it's going to bear a lot of fruit in the future in making sure that the brethren feel a lot more together, and especially the ones from places like India and America, that we're not just these faceless names that they've heard of, that they can actually feel as though they know us and they've made friends with us. So that's what we think it's going to engender, a real sense of belonging.
Fantastic. And Leslie, post pandemic, whenever this might be, what are your big plans? What are your plans for maybe end of 2021, at least 2022?
Well, my plans are to go back to having face-to-face socials like we've had, not particularly at 402, our headquarters, but to do things outside of that, things that not only instructional things on Freemasonry, but I think social, which I think is an important part, that the girls will get together and have a nice social event. And I will continue to do Zoom now forever. This is something I'm never giving up, because it's just proved so wonderful. And I think, and it's very hard for all our girls to get together in London. And it's not so easy for me to do this sort of in all the different counties. So I will, yes, Tina and I will work through something that we can do that's on Zoom, that will carry on and keep them interested. And I will continue to keep our Masons in Waiting interested, because I think that's the essential part of all of this, is not losing those that have shown an interest, and it takes a while. And obviously we're going to have a backlog of initiations, passings and raisings when the time comes. So just to keep everyone happy and yes, and involved, and just find some interesting socials that we can do.
That's really interesting. Brethren, if you have more questions for either Leslie, Tina, Christine, or any other member of the Pale Blue Club, please keep them coming into the chat for the duration of today's social, and we will try and get them to them at the end of the social today. If not, we will get them answered on an extra social.
Thank you very much.
Leslie. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Leslie. Well, we're going to pop on over now to Timothy Winkle for your presentation, if you don't mind.
This is, we can't, hey, oh, can you?
Well, let me see if you can ask him to unmute, Tim. I'm just going to ask him and find him on the list.
Cue elevator music.
There we go.
Sorry about that.
There we go. Okay. Is that working now? Excellent. Okay. Well, thank you to Barry and to Maddie and to Mitch for the invitation to have a chance to meet with you all and speak tonight. I'll try and keep my presentation brief so there's time for question and answer, but I'm also happy to do the extras in the end. So if you have any questions, set them out there and we'll look to get as many answered as we can. I'm going to go and share my screen now. And hopefully that's working. Okay. So again, thanks for having me here tonight. I want to just give you a little overview of my experience, both personally with Freemasonry and professionally with Freemasonry. I've worked or volunteered in 3 different museums dealing with the Masonic collections and fraternal collections. That's the Museum of Freemasonry in London, the collections of Alexandria Washington Lodge number 22 in Alexandria, Virginia, just outside of Washington, and with the National Museum of American History at the Smithsonian Institution, where I'm currently. But since much of my career has been about interpreting fraternalism and Freemasonry, I thought I might give you a little background on where my knowledge comes from, particularly since it helps me relate to audiences where I'm trying to share a message to. So there we go. So I actually, my grandfather was a Freemason, but I grew up not really knowing what that was. I grew up outside of DC. I would see the tower of the George Washington Masonic National Memorial from time to time. To look at that building is to know it has some sort of important, maybe even mystical connotation to it. But what I didn't realize was that was where my grandfather attended lodge. So here he is serving as master of his lodge, Andrew Jackson Lodge number 120 in 1965. And for a time, that my grandfather's name is Thomas Nutwell. And for a time, he was the oldest living past master of his lodge. But I grew up never really considering joining. There's no tradition of it on my father's side of the family. My mother is an only child, so there was no continuing tradition on her side of the family with my grandfather. And like a lot of his generation, and maybe you know this yourselves, he was very tight-lipped. He was very circumspect about his experience in Freemasonry. And I remember a couple times I wanted to talk to him more about it, and those conversations pretty much shut down before they even started. And I really think even once I became a Freemasonry, he was kind of dubious until he saw me, interviewed and passed by the Lodge Tyler when we visited. So apart from him, my first experience with Freemasonry, it was probably, I was just saying to somebody the other day, it was probably Kirk McNulty's book, Freemasonry, A Journey Through Ritual and Symbol. I bought it probably just before I went to university. And was sort of vaguely interested in this kind of tradition, but again, it wasn't something that I had considered affiliating with. So I had a family connection. I had read a well-researched and factual book about Freemasonry. That probably puts me in the 0.01% of public audiences for information about Freemasonry and fraternalism. If I was to pick a third influence, it was probably the Simpsons episode where Homer becomes a stonecutter. That was probably my third introduction to Freemasonry. That put me in a lot better, bigger company. I think that was a lot of people's experience in the 1990s. So, and that's kind of a theme we in the museum field have to come back to, is how can we convey to our audiences something they're going to make a connection with and understand. And with fraternalism and with Freemasonry, you're often starting at just level zero. The information and the understanding and the knowledge of it is either non-existent sometimes with the general public, or perhaps even worse, it's full of misconceptions. I think we all realize that's possible. So when you go to a museum or whatever, when you're going into a public learning situation, you might not know the details of the Battle of Verdun, but you've heard of World War I. You know such a thing happened. When it comes to fraternalism and Freemasonry, sometimes there's not even that level of basic knowledge, and so that's always a challenge that we're looking to. And one of the things I want to kind of contrast is how these different museums handle that, or what challenges they face. So let me start with my first professional position. So I actually graduated with a master's degree in popular culture studies. That was my first MA from Bowling Green State University. It's a unique MA within the United States. And I had experience working in museums and taking museology courses there, and was interested in the ways that history was transmitted to the public. Right? How does the academic make its way to a public audience? And then the next year after I graduated in '98, so in '99, I moved with my first wife to London. She was in the veterinary program, and so I had basically 5 years to live in London. And in the middle of that, I decided to get my second MA in museum studies from University College of London. My first job out of that in 2002, I guess I was hired in early '03, was at the library, what was called then the Library and Museum of Freemasonry. I was a cataloger there, and I mostly worked on photographing and cataloging the jewel collection, right? This enormous jewel collection that they have. And in fact, a couple of years ago, they had an exhibit, Bejeweled, based on that very collection. I still probably didn't know much more about Freemasonry than I did even a decade before. But I mean, you can't go to that building and not find it an intriguing possibility. It was, intriguing place to work, and a real sort of potential adventure there. The collections were wonderful, the staff was wonderful, and obviously the history was something that was attractive. So here's some of the jewels I've worked on. I just picked out some of my favorites. There's the Guildhall School of Music Lodge, Abbey Lodge, Westminster, Ixion Lodge. Ixion Lodge is great. Ixion Lodge was a bicycle lodge from the late 19th century. I think there were like 5 bicycle lodges in London. You see these things on a continuum, and you begin to see these trends that pop up a long time. You see lodges very much mirroring the popular culture and the interests of the day, and bicycling was definitely a big one. And then my final one there, Radium Lodge number 4031. I cataloged that jewel. I held it in my hand. That jewel has a piece of radium in it. In that small center bit is a glass tube of watch glass, and it actually has radium in it. They would turn off the lights, and all their jewels would glow that sort of green light. So I've worked with active radioactive stuff since then, but that was my first. But anyway, that's another example of the kind of thing that was attracting people from the times. radium, electricity, all these sort of early scientific things. You can see all of those reflected. Transatlantic cable, all the epoch, all the points of those epochs are all there. So, you know, the Library and Museum of Freemasonry, or now as it's called, the Museum of Freemasonry, is really, you know, it's dedicated to collecting the history of the United Grand Lodge of England and of Freemasonry in Britain in general. And so, you know, artifacts there are that focus on other fraternal groups are pretty few and far between. You know, if you're going to talk about any other fraternalism, it's about as a legacy of Freemasonry. So another theme that runs through all these museums is how much focus do they give to Freemasonry and how much focus do they give to fraternalism in general? And at UGLE, at Library and Museum of Freemasonry, the focus was almost entirely, as you might expect, on Freemasonry. That's not to say most of the curators I've met were always interested in collecting other fraternal groups. Again, if only to show the legacy of what Freemasonry, you know, kind of brought to the fore. And their challenge at that museum is really, you know, to showcase this history and this legacy to an audience that goes beyond Masons, or frankly, London Masons. I mean, you have a lot of visitors, but you know, it like a lot of London-based museums, the audience is often drawn from London and the home counties, and so you know, you want to spread it not, you know, beyond there, but also to a public audience, and that's one of the most difficult aspects in this museum. The collections are now designated. The new director, Dr. Carroll, is looking to double their attendance in the next few years, and you know, these are big challenges because, you know, you have a building that's a wonderful building that people want to come and see, and so that helps get people in the door. You've actually got now a wonderful gift shop and things like that. There are ways to get people through the door, but it always comes down to two barriers. The one is that lack of knowledge I spoke of on the part of the public, maybe even lack of interest in the subject. We all have to remember what it was like before we were interested and engaged in Freemasonry. You know, think back to that and think how was I drawn to it? What interested me in it, and how can I do that for the public? But the other challenge was a really simple one, is that people didn't think we were open to the public. People thought we were, you know, this hermetic, you know, grandiose pile that only Freemasons could go in if they flashed a certain sign. And so we did a lot to promote lunchtime talks, to work with, to put out a lot of temporary exhibits and try and get them advertised in, you know, non-Masonic sources. We tried to piggyback on events like London Open House and things like the Big Draw, trying to get school groups in, if possible, or at least young people in whatever way we can. And exhibits like that Bejeweled exhibit do a good job of drawing audiences beyond those who are interested in Freemasonry as a subject by looking at things like decorative arts and design. And so you kind of utilize your collection, which has wonderfully deep depth in all types of different areas. And how might it appeal outside of strict, you know, fraternal barriers? So speaking of lunchtime talks, this is another one I've got. So I had the opportunity while I was there to give a lunchtime talk, and I did some research on and was interested in cross-Atlantic Freemasonry, you know, Masonic connections between America and England, and in particular in the context of the kind of growing sentiment of Anglo-Saxonism in the 19th century. And so I gave that talk, and then I was invited by the late Michael Bagent to contribute an article to Freemasonry Today based on that research, and to look specifically at 3 London lodges that were Anglo-American lodges, that being Anglo-American Lodge 2192, Columbia Lodge 2397, and America Lodge 3368. And here's one of their past masters and a honorary membership jewel. Now, the secretary of America Lodge, Frank Baber, he really generously lent me his minute books so I could basically go through and research them. And I struck up a relationship with him and with the incoming master, Tom Smith, who was a fellow American. And I kind of decided if I was going to join, this is the lodge I wanted to join. This was a lodge that had a history of Anglo-American connection. And they seemed a great bunch. They actually met at Mark Mason Hall and had their meals at the Army-Navy Club down the street. So it was really kind of swanky, quite a posh setting for a provincial like myself to be in. So, it had a lot of appeal. But and at the back of my mind, I thought two things. I thought here's a connection to my grandfather that I can have, which is something that was important to me. But also here's a connection I can have to history. Here's an organization that's been around for centuries, and I fancy myself something of a historian, and it would be interesting and engaging and enlightening to be part of that tradition and not just study it, but actually be in the body of it. So these were the kind of two things in my head at the time. And so I initiated in 2003, and then early in 2004, I kind of sped through because I was leaving England in 2004. I was raised actually in Canada Lodge. They had to shoehorn me in and get my raising in. So I was actually raised in Canada Lodge 3527. So I had a pretty rapid progression. But then I was back in the States and had barely spent much time as a Mason in England. Was unsure how to go about it in the States, and that kind of left me a little bit adrift. There were a few things that still tied me to Masonry when I lived in Richmond, and I volunteered for the Grand Lodge of Virginia's museum for a time, and I visited a couple lodges in this time, and perhaps the most satisfying thing was I was able to accompany my grandfather to lodge. He had a little trouble getting around. He really could use someone going, and it was more than just that practicality. It was nice to be able to share that tradition with him. We went to at least one past masters night that was joint between his lodge and Alexandria Washington Lodge, and so I got to see what his experience had been, where he had gone to lodge all these years. And that was really, really nice. And soon after, Alexandria Washington Lodge invited me to contract with them for my museum services and work on their extensive collections. And so that was kind of my, rather than joining my grandfather's lodge, I joined the other one in the building because they had an even deeper history, and because they had a collection that I had some expertise in helping. So I affiliated with them. I think 2006. I affiliated with Alexandria Washington Lodge. Now they have a collection here. You can see what they call the Replica Lodge Room and some collections in the ante room. There's some of their collections there too. The lodge actually occupies George Washington National Masonic Memorial, and is one of the primary reasons why that memorial was constructed, why it was initiated in the early 20th century. There had been a fire in the 1870s that destroyed the City Hall of Alexandria, but also within that City Hall was the lodge. They had been given rooms there, and they had these extensive museum collections even then that were associated with George Washington. And there was a fear that if they were by and large rescued, some things were lost, but they never wanted to see the threat of fire face those collections again. And so one of the main drives for building such a monumental structure was to have a proper home and safe storage for those valuable collections. But the reason they had them was because Alexandria Washington Lodge has founded one of the oldest museums in the United States. It's not a very well-known story, but they created a museum called the Alexandria Museum in 1812, a public museum, one of the handful of early public museums in America. And their collections were extensive and interesting in and of themselves. They actually had nothing to do per se with Freemasonry. They were set up to show natural history specimens and anthropological specimens and archaeological specimens. Very much the kind of model that the British Museum had bequeathed, very much the model that Peale's Museum in Philadelphia had shown the way to. And so they had created this museum, which was effectively the first permanent museum in the Washington, D.C. area, some 3 decades before the Smithsonian, was this museum showing what the founder called a he wanted it to be a seminary for the learned and the unlearned alike, as he called it. And you see right there, there was so here's some of the Washington collections. So that's a portrait of Washington from life, the only Masonic portrait of Washington from life. The trowel he used to lay the cornerstone of the Capitol. His apron, which was one of the only 2 aprons known to belong to George Washington. So these are some of the collections that were popularized, but they had all these other collections during the 19th century. And these pieces were actually kept in the lodge. The public would have never seen them. And so, but like I say, by the end of the 19th century, there was this fire. A lot of the things that weren't related to Washington were lost, and the attention was drawn back to George Washington. So you have a collection that went from being this kind of universal examination of nature and culture to a collection that was focused primarily on Washington and Washington as a Mason. So you lost the original story. You also lost the story of the lodge. It's sort of sublimated to Washington, but the lodge is founded in 1783. It has quite a history in and of itself, but it really was very much sublimated to the idea of Washington and Washington the Mason. And so by the time they create what we saw, the replica room, the replica lodge room, which was meant to be a historical recreation of Washington, of a lodge from Washington's time, the shift is totally complete. By the early 19th century, everything is meant to emphasize him. So you have a museum that has its own historical legacy as a pioneering institution, but a museum that also has these important artifacts related to George Washington, a museum that's partnered with a historic building and trying to convey the story of Freemasonry at the same time. And so you have all these kind of mutual obligations that are competing with each other. And my goal, primarily when I was there, was to try and emphasize some of the stories beyond George Washington, to talk about Freemasonry itself, the role of Freemasonry in American history, the role of Freemasonry in the city, and the legacy of this important but forgotten public museum. Now, about the same time I affiliated with Alexandria Washington Lodge, I was hired as a project assistant at the National Museum of American History. We had gotten this huge collection of firefighting material. I had no experience with firefighting, but I could do the job. And so I spent about 5 years processing that collection. And at the end of that, I was hired as an assistant curator. I'd spent 5 years on the job. They said, hey, you can curate, you can be responsible for the fire collections. And didn't you work for a Freemasons museum at some point? So why don't we give you that too? In fact, why don't we just give you something called community organizations? And so not only did I get fraternal history, I also got things like scouting. So I'm also the curator responsible for Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts. I often say everything you do outside your house, but you don't get paid for, is pretty much what my areas are, and firefighting and law enforcement as well. So as a curator with National Museum of American History, my mission is a lot broader than those last two. So of course I do have fraternal collections, and like the Museum of Freemasonry, I'm challenged to present and interpret Freemasonry to an audience that might be unfamiliar with it as a concept, much less of it as its role in history and society. You know, and when people come to the National Museum of American History, there's a self-selection that isn't there, right? If you're going to something called the Museum of Freemasonry, you pretty much know what you're getting into. You know, it does what it says on the tin. If you walk in, you expect to see that subject. You walk into the National Museum of American History, you don't know what you're going to see. You're going to see everything. And so there's a little bit, not only of trying to get the message across, but also jostling for space, right? Trying to get your message across while there's also things about the American presidency or American inventions or the history of business in America. These are all exhibits we have. And like the collections at Alexandria Washington Lodge, there's over a century of sometimes eclectic and unfocused collecting. The earliest Masonic pieces in the collection are from about 1900. So they're older than that themselves, but they have been at the Smithsonian since around 1900. There's actually little focused collecting around Freemasonry or fraternalism in the past. And so material would come in, let's say it's from a general and he happened to be a Freemason, so we'd get his apron too. His other stuff would go to military history, but his apron would kind of filter down to what we would call cultural history. Or, family collections would come in and maybe one or two men in that were also Freemasons, would get their stuff. But there was never this kind of concentrated, concerted effort to collect Freemasonry or fraternalism. So we just kind of got what we got, and some of it's wonderful. But some stories are missing, and some focuses are missing. And so there's some great finds, but when you do it in a kind of random way, you do miss out. So there's some wonderful pieces there. Oldest one there is the Past Masters Jewel. That's 1805 Past Masters Jewel for Washington Lodge number 21 in New York City. Some ice cream molds and an earthenware jug and a 1820s printed apron and a 1810 Mark Mason jewel. So again, wonderful stuff and a real variety of stuff. But in addition to Freemasonry, I have to talk about the differences within Freemasonry. Appendant bodies and side orders, Knights Templar, like the brother on the left, a whole parallel traditions of African-American Freemasonry, like Prince Hall Masonry, things like the shrine there on the right. So explaining the development of these kind of side orders and things that then further get into the weeds of things that we might be familiar with, or at least passingly familiar with. But again, the general public has just gotten their mind around what fraternalism and Freemasonry was. And then you say, oh, by the way, there's 1,000 other things going on. So it is a challenge. And then, of course, the bigger challenge is I can't, as within the Smithsonian, I'm not tasked just with Freemasonry, obviously, but with fraternalism in general, American fraternalism in general. And so, we have hundreds of objects unrelated to Freemasonry, but part of the legacy of Freemasonry. Freemasonry begins in the U.S. in the 1720s, and pretty much is the progenitor of every other fraternal tradition. But within America, you have unique fraternal traditions. I mentioned Prince Hall Freemasonry. You have the rise of things like fraternal benefit societies, which became the kind of building blocks of the insurance industry in America. You have even the tradition of different traditions reflected. The OUAM was a nativist fraternal body that was against Catholic Irish immigration. So, I mean, there are objects in here that speak to larger American history trends, as well as the organizations themselves. So there's a lot to mine and a lot of personal stories, but also a lot of wider stories to use Freemasonry and fraternalism to help tell that story. And the job is really never complete. But the challenge is a good one. Like I said, I do firefighting. Everybody knows what firefighting is, so I find it a little more interesting to try and get people to leave an exhibit that I've put something in and go, oh yeah, Freemasonry, I've heard of that. Sometimes that's enough to at least get people thinking and wanting to learn more, and perhaps even explore affiliating or joining, if not Freemasonry, some fraternal body themselves. So anyway, I'll leave it there. That was just sort of a brief overview, but I'm more than happy to take some questions and hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much, Tim. That was really interesting. Could literally listen to you for hours, but alas, time is upon us. We've had a fair few questions in. Please keep your questions coming in. Put them in the chat, and we'll get them over to Tim shortly. Right. So in no particular order, let's go back to what you were saying about the radium in the jewel, and I think Kit has a question similar to that. Oh, it's Nathan from the Byron Club. Apologies.
All right.
You just unmute yourself and ask a question.
Oh, apologies. Is that working now?
Yes.
Perfect.
I had a couple of questions about the Radium Lodge jewels.
Mhm.
As a physics teacher, it's quite a peculiarity because I can't imagine many of the members of that lodge got their 60-year pin.
Well, I have to say,
I can't take credit for that one, but
it's pretty. I mean, that's a pretty thick jewel. I will say it's under fairly thick watch glass. But you're right. It's not something. But remember though, this is. I'm trying to remember when that lodge was founded. I think right before 1920, and people were putting radium in drinks. I mean, it was like energy, literally the energy drink at the time. So there was a real lack of full understanding of the impact of that kind of thing. So why not put it in a lodge jewel, right?
yeah, absolutely. I'm just imagining my radiation officer going mental at me. But yeah, that's it's just one of those peculiarities of the era, I guess.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sure.
Mitch, you want to unmute yourself?
Apologies. I can just see it now being presented with your radium jewel, and you're really like, no, thank you. I'll pass.
Just keep that.
You
over
really
there.
shouldn't. You really shouldn't have.
I think that lodge is gone now, unfortunately, which is a shame.
Oh, yeah, we can speculate why, but not tonight. Kit Barker, if you could ask your question, please.
Hi, I was literally wondering about the top hats because I think they look amazing in all the photos there. And being in the British Freemasonry, you don't really see it that often. I'm just wondering how far up or what kind of lodge you need to be in to get a top hat.
Yeah, I haven't really explored that tradition, but it is a very American tradition. It's certainly in my lodge, except in the summer where some people would wear kind of a straw hat for what we had a little, if you had some style. But yeah, I suspect even in lodges that don't have a very formal attire for their meetings, it was a sort of indication of not so much class, but high office, right? So your statesmen of the late 19th century are all going to be wearing top hats. And so it's a way of signaling authority. Only, obviously only the master is wearing one. So it's a way of kind of, of affiliating with leadership and authority, and something that comes short of a crown. So it's also slightly more democratic. I suspect that's where the tradition goes through, because that fashion is what really comes in the really in the late 19th century. As many times as you see Abraham Lincoln, that's a bit early for that. So I think what you also see is the late 19th century in America is the high watermark for American fraternalism and for Freemasonry, and so a lot of the aesthetics, a lot of the style and visual traditions that we have were all sort of formed, 120 years ago, 130 years ago. And so that probably is just one of those things that caught on. But I haven't really done a good look into that. So you've sort of piqued my interest. I might have to see if I can track down how far that goes back.
Might have to rejoin it up in the UK, to restart the fashion.
Yeah. Does it be a good import?
Absolutely.
Great question. Okay, we're going to go over to Luke Appleby of Concord Lodge in Huddersfield for your question.
Forgot what my question was now.
About Andrew Jackson.
Oh right, yeah. So the name Andrew Jackson. Where's that from?
So Andrew Jackson was the I'm gonna embarrass myself, 11th president of the United States. But he was the president in the early 19th century. He was, if you had to pick a Masonic president in the 19th century that everybody knew, first was Washington, second was Andrew Jackson. So he the lodge itself was founded, I think, mid-19th century. It's 120 in the Virginia Constitution, which is fairly low. So that's where it comes from. It comes from that president. And again, you already had a Alexandria Washington Lodge. Washington had been an honorary member of Alexandria Lodge and its titular master in 1789. And so, if you were then seeking legitimacy and prestige by naming yourself for another Masonic president in the mid-19th century, Andrew Jackson would have been really the only other option. So they're still going fairly strong as well. There's only 2 lodges at the memorial. They actually have the more interesting lodge room, as far as I'm concerned. But that's where it originates.
Great, thank you. Just sort of on that same question, there's I suppose a lot of royalty and kings over here in the UK being heads of the order. Lots of political historic Americans like Andrew Jackson, Ben Franklin, who coincidentally is his birthday today. FYI. Oh. There you go. You can have that. And lots more. Washington. As political figures and huge parts of American history, how much does the history of Freemason matter when you talk about Ben Franklin, when you talk about Washington? Is the Masonic side always brought up, or is it just, oh, he also happened to be a Freemason?
I would say Freemasonry and fraternalism in general, as a historical theme, as something that is, attended to by academia, has been, I don't think any longer, but has been a kind of also ran, right? As a kind of other subject, or at worst a curiosity, at best adding a little context. I think that's now changing somewhat. So when you look at a figure like Franklin, I think his Masonic career, his affiliation with Freemasonry, is going to come up to contextualize his social striving in his young years, or his work to become a successful printer, become a well-known civic figure in Philadelphia, and being Grandmaster of Pennsylvania and of a very small body of Masons there early on, is part of that, right? Washington is a somewhat desultory Mason. There is something to be said there that he's not attending lodges. He's like a friend and well-wisher of Masonry, more than someone like early on in Franklin's life, or someone like Paul Revere, for instance. These are figures for whom Masonry, held a lot of pull and interest. So these things come up now and then, but again, I think they still, to some degree, remain specialist topics. And I think in general, you're going to find, most historians might find them interesting, but perhaps not too insightful into the history of these figures. And I think one of the challenges is trying to show that there is some something to be mined there by their joining the craft, and not only what their experience with Freemasonry might tell us about them in general, but also what it tells us about the history of the United States at the time, who was joining, how was Masonry thought of by the general public? Does Masonry get some benefit of, kind of shine from Washington's halo, right? If Washington is this great man, Mason or not, but everyone knew he was a Mason, does Masonry enjoy a kind of reflected light? Possibly. And so, it's a really good area to explore contextually, but it does take some information. It does take some digging, and that hasn't really been the case in mainstream history, I'd say, until maybe the last 10 or 15 years.
Amazing. Paul Ashby of Cambridgeshire Light Blues, do you want to ask your question, because this sort of leads on from this this subject? Paul, are you there? Okay, Paul said, Tim, what is...
Oh, there he is. There he
Oh,
is.
there you go, Paul. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not getting it.
Okay. Paul, I think your Zoom's gone a bit mad. Let's try one more time.
Unmute. There we are. That's better.
There we go.
Perfect.
Oh, goodness me, technology. Yes, Tim, I've been hearing a little bit about Paul Revere being a Freemason just recently, funnily enough. As most of us UK Freemasons haven't even heard of Paul Revere, you know, much less his input into Freemasonry. Could you tell us, without wasting too much of your time, about his input into Freemasonry, please?
Paul Revere was, and I'm trying to remember when, because he's not a specialist subject for me, but sometime in the 1790s, I think he was Grand Master of the Massachusetts Freemasons. So he was very invested in his membership. So sort of unlike Washington, who either had no time or the disinclination to actually regularly attend lodge, you know, Paul Revere had quite a Masonic career. And again, that's reflective of someone who was, you know, sort of middle to upper middle class artisan, someone who was acquiring wealth, someone who was trying to run in social circles. So he's very much I think he very much reflects a kind of typical urban Freemason in the early Republic, someone who is not the great and the good. One of the real appeals of Masonry by the 1790s and 1780s, 1790s is the shift from moderns to ancients. The ancients appealed intentionally to middle classes and aspiring classes in the urban centers, and the sort of good and great in the hinterlands, whereas the moderns had sort of focused more on urban grandees and left the hinterlands completely ignored. That helped solidify, I think, the popularity of Freemasonry, at least that branch of Freemasonry, in America. And I think Revere really reflects that. If you haven't heard of Revere, the one thing everybody in America knows about Paul Revere is that he rode in the night to warn Boston and the outlying areas of the approach of the British regulars, crying, "The British is coming! The British are coming! The British are coming!" Right? That's pretty much his cameo in average American history. But again, there's a much deeper vein to be mined when you look at his experience with fraternalism and how it reflected his social mobility, and also the society of a sort of Boston at the time. So yeah, he's an interesting figure. He's very reflective of. He's the equivalent of Ben Franklin when Ben Franklin was up and coming in the 1730s, right? So 60 years later, it's somebody like Revere.
Fantastic. So interesting. So interesting. Dan Cook, I think this is a question referring to the temple at the Washington Memorial. Dan Cook, do you want to ask your question?
Oh, yeah. I just noticed there didn't seem to be a Masonic checkered carpet on the floor. I just wondered if there was a reason for that.
All right. Let's see. Was that the picture of my grandfather?
I think it was the one with the recreation of the Washington, the lodge room with Washington.
Oh, right. Well, so there's two things. Really, until about we didn't have a checkered carpet in my lodge at Alexandria, Washington until about 15 years ago, 10 years ago. It's not, and I couldn't tell you exactly why. I don't think it's required. That may be different because, of course, there's a Grand Lodge for every state. But I have certainly, when I affiliated with Alexandria Washington Lodge, there was no checkered floor. The replica lodge room is a kind of a different situation because that is a best approximation of what they thought in the 1940s what a lodge room might have looked like in the 1790s. It's by and large wrong. The furniture is all wrong. There's some neo-Gothic mid-19th century stuff in there. There are spittoons that are not to the right date. It's a mishmash. And so the lack of carpet on the floor might have been from their understanding. I don't know for sure. It could be practical because, of course, it's a public space that had heavy visitation, and so they might have just wanted wooden floors to make for ease of clean. So I couldn't tell you for sure why that is, but I will say that that checkered floors are not universal in American Masonry, and I think I'm pretty sure I've been visited a couple of lodges or talked to a couple of lodges that don't have them as well. So they are not universal.
Thank you. Cheers.
I know for a fact I had a tour of the Massachusetts Grand Lodge, and in neither of their rooms, or I think they've got maybe 10 or so, there's no carpets of checkered.
Right. And when we got ours at Alexandria Washington Lodge, I think the intent by the master at the time and the secretary at the time was to make that connection to tradition. So, you know, I think American Freemasonry grows in ways that don't always mirror the kind of 200 years of tradition, and in some ways some lodges are trying to reclaim that a bit.
Fantastic. We're going to go over to Paul Mansell of the Manchester Level Club.
Hi, thanks, Mitch. Tim, great presentation, very interesting. Thank you. I can also commend you on the castle in the background. I have to say, I've been fascinated all the way through your presentation and trying to work out whether it's what it's all about. But my question, in all seriousness, fast forward to your successor in maybe 100 years' time. What do you think the artifact of the future would be?
To represent Freemasonry and fraternalism?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I mean, there are areas in the collection right now that are underrepresented. So my efforts to look back at 200, 300, really almost 300 years of American fraternalism are to try and collect those areas. So I'm trying to collect more around Prince Hall Freemasonry. I'm trying to collect more in the 18th century because we did not have much representation when I got there. But I always have an eye, and it's particularly because I had my first MA in popular culture studies, and I'm interested in contemporary collecting. I always have an eye towards contemporary collecting and trying to represent. I always say I try and collect today for tomorrow just as much as I collect yesterday for today. So it's a question that's always on my mind. I think one of the things that is kind of key is trying to collect around fraternal groups that are not going to be around in the next 20, 30 years. As challenging as drawing membership to Freemasonry is, other major fraternal groups, Oddfellows, Knights of Pythias, these groups they're huge. Oddfellows was bigger than Freemasonry in 1900 in America, and Oddfellowship is on severe wane in America now. I think one of the priorities is to try and collect those traditions before they disappear, so that there is something, even if they don't exist in 100 years from now, that there's something to show for it. But then I think the other thing is to show, is to try and get a sense of what fraternalism means to modern membership. And that comes from collecting around personal stories as much as about the institutions themselves. So trying to collect from individual Freemasons, individual Oddfellows, individual members, and try and get their stories, and perhaps then have an artifact to hang that story on. But frankly, it's the story that's more interesting. It's the information that they can provide us about the meaning it gives them, the meaning they give to their object, than it would be just to have the object itself. So preserving that information around the object is just as important as preserving the object. So you know, that's a big thing. And I think the other thing is to try and show the diversity and the different directions that American fraternalism has gone, because it's I think a very uniquely American experience that fraternalism brings. Not that fraternalism is unique to America, but there's an American stamp on it, and the idea of using it in all types of different ways, for civil rights, for something as simple as savings and insurance, for obviously social interaction. So looking at things like, we have something called the Red Hat Society over here. I think you may have it in the UK too, for women. That's not a fraternal group per se, but it's a group that is in the flow of American fraternalism in general, of which the progenitor is Freemasonry. So trying to show the different branches as much as possible, and to some extent that means not collecting Freemasonry. Not that I don't, but Freemasonry still has a voice. There are collections, whether they be the Scottish Rite, both the northern and the southern jurisdiction museums, and the Memorial has a museum, and there's at least 4 or 5. Every Grand Lodge has a collection, or at least most of them do. So Freemasonry doesn't need me to advocate for it or to collect it as much. I hope and expect it to be around in 100 years. I certainly want to tell that story because it is so fundamental. But I think being able to preserve all these other strains of the fraternal tradition are perhaps much more of a priority for me, because they are either gone or in the process of severe decline. And once they're gone, it'll be very difficult to retrieve not only their physical collections, but obviously the stories that go with those.
Thank you, Tim. I'm aware we've got running out of time. If we could just have 2 more questions, we'll go to Guillermo first of the Byron Club. Either one of your questions, or if you can wrap them around each other, then great.
Oh,
can't hear you. I don't know why.
Is that better?
That's much.
Yes, there you go.
There we go. You got to hit the right button. I'm Guillermo from Bremkit 8750 and also the Byron Club here in Nottinghamshire. 2 questions, Tim. First, thank you. Great lecture. Learned a lot about American Freemasonry, which is something that I'm trying to learn about because I am American. But did you find going from English Freemasonry to American Freemasonry difficult? And does the American Lodge in London still exist?
Yes. So America 3368 still exists. Yes.
Cool.
So I would recommend. I think, in fact, all 3 of those Anglo-American lodges that I mentioned, I believe all 3 still exist. So I recommend visiting sometime if you can. My lodge actually started as only for Americans, and they had to change that, I think, in about 1937. They founded in 1912, and by 1937 they realized they didn't have enough Americans. So they had to share out. Did I find it difficult to transfer? Yes, for 2 reasons. One, there's obviously differences in ritual and whatnot, going from England to Virginia, the Virginia Grand Lodge. But the other was I hadn't been a Mason that long. I had not been in my lodge all that long. I think less than a year, which is a bit of a whirlwind. And so I think I'd only attended 4 lodge meetings while in the UK, and 3 of them I was having degrees conveyed on me. So so I wasn't a really experienced or veteran Mason, and then switch traditions and then have the sort of obligation of sort of living up to my grandfather's expectations added to that. So yes, it was a little bit difficult, and I still I have to say still find myself trying to remember where my right hand is from my left on occasion. But I will say it's I've been to different lodges where there's been more or less formality, and my Alexandria Washington Lodge, I think, prides itself on its ritual and on its formality. So that's even more intimidating coming into that that atmosphere as well. But I feel like at least I know what foot to put where now. So there is that.
Thank you very much.
Great question. Right, one more. We're going to go to Philip Titterton from Lodge of Friendship, number 44. Legend in his own right.
Was that legend or legend? Right. Okay. Let's assume that Masonic ritual is not anybody's first language. So what I'm looking at and what I'm interested in is unwrapping what is actually covered in our Masonic ritual. Now, Tim, can you just confirm, do you find American Masonry familiar or recognizable in relation to English Masonry?
Oh, yes, I would say so. I mean, there's some minor differences, but generally.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. Because as I understand it, Masonry Universal is recognizable, whether it's American, Scottish Rite, Irish, whatever, in a way that, say, politics isn't. So if we go right back into the 17th century, when our Masonry was evolving, you mentioned there that American Freemasonry was clearly establishing itself in the very early 1700s.
Yeah.
The first Grand Lodge was founded in London in 1717, four lodges. And also, whilst I'm thinking about it, just a point there, our lodge, which was founded in 1755, was actually a burial society. So that ties in with the point you made there about community involvement. What is it about Freemasonry over education, over politics, over whatever? What is it that has made it Masonry universal? What are the themes that everybody can recognize, can honor, whereas, say, if you particularly look at politics or you look at finance or whatever, they all have all the different cultures have their own take on it, whereas it doesn't seem to be that way with Masonry.
Right. Well, I'm glad you gave me an easy question there. I would say, well, there's so many other possibilities, right? But I would say that you have Freemasonry coming around at the right time, and part of that is because the right time bred the rise of Freemasonry. But I think when you have that intersection with Enlightenment ideals, with growing humanism, these kind of things appealed both in the late 17th century, but also in the early 18th century, in England and Scotland, in America, wherever. I think you have these ideas of, I think you have the idea also of a society of men that that allows for, in a way, for social vetting, if that makes sense. That particularly, I think when you get to the revolution in America, when you have the break and you have the establishment revolution, you have this sense of the Enlightenment made real, and this idea of brotherhood and egalitarianism. But there's still there's still these kind of tokens of respectability, tokens of good character that people are still looking for. In a society among equals, how do you differentiate people? How do you know the good ones from the bad ones, I guess? So Masonry, is one way to sort of signal that, right? You've been brought in by a group that is essentially vouching for your good character. It's similar in a way to military rank that way. So there's a kind of bigger theme, which is the way it dovetails so nicely with the ideas of Enlightenment, the ideas of that are coming to the fore in the late 17th and the early 18th centuries. But you also have this very practical idea of not only the sociability, not only fraternalism, these are all very positive things, but also this idea of how do I make a mark in society? How does society know that I am a person that is, has integrity and worthy of respect? It's a badge of that, right? In a world today where we don't see Freemasonry in public very often, this is a world where Freemasonry was very much a public thing. And so I think those two strains, like I said, there's many more, but I think those two strains, both kind of high-minded and practical, are the two that, if nothing else, I think particularly appeal in American Freemasonry.
Thank you.
Mitch,
you want to?
Oh, sorry, I spent my life telling people to unmute and then I never did it. What I was saying was, I've just put in the chat that we've run out of time for today. So if you pop a question in the chat, we will get it to Tim in an extra. So please look out for that, and we'll say your name and your lodge or your club, and we'll get Tim to answer that. So we really appreciate it. I think Tim, I think your presentation was good, but we had more questions in the chat about the castle behind you. So did you just quickly want to say something about that?
So the castle is one of my kids' toys that they no longer play with, but I have to put it somewhere, and so I thought it was sort of it's a nice backdrop. It's kind of aspirational when I can finally go out and visit places like this. So, but yeah, I just it's literally to just seem more interesting than I am.
You don't need the castle. You don't need the castle. All right. Like I said, we're just going to take a quick cheers a photo, which we'll put on Twitter and Facebook and the like. So if all we need, I'll hand over to Alan. He'll do the screenshots. Just hold up your glass, and after three, we'll just smile. You okay, Alan? Ready?
Yep. 3, 2, 1. I'm just going to take one more because we've got 2 screens. 3, 2, 1. Done.
Fantastic. Over to you, Matty.
Yep. Well, thank you, Tim, for coming on. Again, amazing talk. It's been brilliant to have you. Thank you on behalf of everyone for coming here and giving your talk about who you are, the positions you've had, and everything else in between. It's been brilliant. So thank you very much.
Thank you all for the great questions. It's always nice to have an audience that's interested and engaged. So thank you.
And we'll be seeing you again. We'll arrange for you to come on and do an extra and just finish off some of the questions. Sure. Finish. That'll be brilliant. And thank you to Worshipful Brother Leslie and everyone at the Pale Blue Club. Thank you so much for coming on. I mean, looking at some of the interclub WhatsApp messages that we've been having, and in the chat menu that that we've been seeing, particularly I think with the potential candidates coming in, and you focus on those brethren, I think you've got some really great initiatives, and I think a lot of people taken away a lot of your ideas and stolen them for themselves. But it's been great, and we really appreciate having you.
Thank you for inviting me.
No, our pleasure. Thank you. We're going to leave it there. Thank you all for coming on. It's been a great start to 2021, and look forward to our next meetings. You're all welcome to come on. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you again, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you, Christine.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Take care, guys.